Let's do this. Okay, hello. Welcome to a special live call with Needle Marketing. We have the lovely Andy Lulka here. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good, and you're in Toronto, right?
I am in Toronto.
Yeah, how's the weather there?
Cold, gray, not very snowy right now.
I could say that because I'm in Minnesota, so I'm like almost in Canada. So
Yeah. Is it like that in Minnesota too today?
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it was raining, which is really odd and sad in January. But
Yeah. Well, I think
anyway.
we're expecting snow today, so that'll be good.
Got it. And we've got Tammy here live. Hi, Tammy. All right. So we are going to talk about self-care for Montessori professionals. And I'm so excited to have you here because this has been your focus for the past month, right? With your group kind of working through all of the details of what self-care is and how we, apply it and work through it in the Montessori world.
Yeah, it was really exciting because when we first envisioned doing self-care, we were thinking about, what can we offer guides in December? And December is just such a period of unsettlement for guides because you're coming to the end of the year and it's all exciting, but at the same time it's really stressful, but it's so celebratory and it's so much love, but it's so much stress. So we figured self-care is a good thing to look at. And then, we asked our members, do you want to, stay light and focus on self-care strategies, or do you want to dig deep into self-care and see okay, what are the societal and historical narratives that are affecting the way I look at this? And they wanted to go deep, so that's what we did.
Yes, and you're going to share with us all those goodies that you guys have discovered. I'm so excited. I feel like this is going to be such a good conversation and so needed and timely, right? It's January. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's kind of one of those long seasons where you're like, all right, I'm ready for spring. So it's just really timely to have this conversation.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think any time is a good time to talk about self-care, honestly.
I love it. You advocate for that. I love it.
I do.
So a little bit about you, and if you wouldn't mind, you've got a really unique story. You have been a Montessorian your entire life, right? Like even before you were born. So that's cool. Tell us a little bit more about your history.
Yeah, so my grandmother got into Montessori before my mother had children. So when my mother was pregnant with my older sister, my grandmother gave her a copy of The Absorbent Mind. And, from there, the rest is history. That's how we started.
Nice.
My mom went into training when she sent me to a CASA program. So we started at the same time, which is kind of nice.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah.
So then your professional Montessori career started in 2004 and you were guiding a primary classroom.
Yes. Yeah. I never completely split from Montessori because my mom was always so involved in her own classrooms, but also in leadership and in the community and whatnot. So I was always there. As a teenager, I would help her with her school trips and, stuff like that. So I was never fully, totally distant from it, but I did pursue other career paths. And I came back to Montessori because I had my child. And as so many of us do, it was a moment of what am I doing with my life? What do I want to do with my life? And it was no, I actually belong in Montessori. This is where I want to be. So I came back. And yes, so I started as a 3 to 6 guide, and I also became the music teacher for the entire school. So it was up to grade 6 at the time. So I was working with all the age levels. And then I started the middle school at the school as well. So I have most of my adolescent training, but I was not able to finish it. I hope to still finish it one day.
Got it. Oh, it's such an interesting journey. I love hearing about people's experiences with Montessori, and you have such a long history, a family history too. So you recently just started a new initiative called Integrating Montessori, and the goal, right, of Integrating Montessori is to create an online professional development community for guides mainly, but do you also welcome administrators?
Anybody. Yeah. What we say is you don't need formal training to join Integrating Montessori, but it's also not a good place to start with Montessori. It really is professional development.
Mm-hmm.
And it works for people who are not in the classroom. It works for people who are in the classroom. Even for people like me who are just, at home and doing professional development for other people. It's really about digging really deep into Montessori philosophy and practice and applying it to wherever we are in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So for an administrator, it could be like, how do I administer in a more Montessori way, right? Like, how do I schedule my meetings in a more Montessori way? How do I approach my staff in a more Montessori way? How do I agenda my meetings in a more Montessori way, right?
Yeah.
And we will get to some of that during the presentation too.
Yes. Awesome.
Yeah.
So, this is a good segue to just kind of jump in and start working on self-care. So I know you've got some slides you want to share with us. And if you're attending live, chat in the questions. I'll make sure we've got a couple other attendees that have joined us. I'll keep an eye on the chat, Andy, so don't worry about that.
Okay.
And then we'll just kind of go along. We'll have questions that come in, or we may, have some tangents that we go on. But of course, this is really meant to be valuable for you attendees and for those of you watching the recordings as well.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're taking care of that so I can focus on talking with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So self-care for the Montessori professional. As I was saying, we thought it was a good topic because we know that a lot of our members have a hard time finding the balance, right? And we're constantly hearing about self-care these days. And we thought, okay, this would be a good way to support people in a lighter way, right? Where we're not digging into heavy texts and talking about discipline and stuff like that for once. And also because self-care is really important. Montessori is really hard, right? It's not an easy profession. It's not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of courage to really do Montessori well. We are service providers, which means that we're constantly giving of ourselves. And we are counterculture. We're always going against what people believe about children. We're always going against what people believe about school. And Montessori is demanding, right? Montessori said we have to be this kind of saint, right? We have to go through the spiritual preparation and we have to let go of all of our biases and all of this. And that is hard work. It is hard work. And it's work that's very demanding of our spirits. And so what happens when we go and we try and meet the needs of other people, whether it's our staff or the children in our classrooms, and our needs are not being met and our spirits are not being fulfilled, then what happens? We see a lot of burnout, we see a lot of demoralization. And so having a deep look at self-care really helped a lot of our members kind of reassess where they are on that scale and to understand why prioritizing ourselves is not a disservice to our work. In fact, it is necessary for us to be able to do our work and to put our best selves out there in the service of our communities.
Right. Yeah, so lovely. So beautifully said, because I feel like when you have, it's almost like fuel, right? Fuel for your body. We think so much, we spend so much time on how we eat or how we live our life and how we be. But like this particular topic is about refueling ourselves so we can do the best work that we can. And I know you're going to dive into a little bit of like the misconceptions of self-care, right? Because it is so mainstream now and it's almost like a taboo, like it's bubble baths and chocolates and then you'll just be fine, right? And it's not that. It is so very opposite of that.
No, and I love the bubble baths and I love the chocolate and thank you for that, but I need more than that, right?
Right.
And so that's what we did. And so one of the I can't seem to, there it is. Okay. So there was a resurgence of the term self-care in 2016. And it was actually like the Google searches for self-care just shot up at the end of 2016. And it was a response to a real collective need to manage a global anxiety, right? Because it was right after the US election, and it was almost like the blinders were ripped off for a lot of people. And they just suddenly realized that, this is not the world that we thought we had been living in. And it forced us to see that there is actually a global rise in populism and authoritarianism and in expressions of hate. And all of a sudden, people were feeling so incredibly uncertain that they needed to find ways to, find some stability and find some way of feeling better. So we started connecting through social media, and we started Googling self-care. And that's where all of this all of a sudden started to bubble up, right? But what happened is that self-care became commodified, and that's what you were talking about. It's chocolates and bubble baths and bottles of wine. It's something we have to pay for. So it becomes inaccessible for a lot of people. It's a one size fits all thing, which, we're not one size fits all. You and I are very different. And when you give me a self-care manual that tells me that I have to exercise 3 times a week, living with a chronic illness, that is actually very harmful for me. And so I end up feeling like I can't do that. Mm. And so it causes a tension in me, because they're saying this is good for you, and I'm saying, no, this is not. So a tension grows. Again, a lot of it is inaccessible to us. It's also very individualistic. A lot of the things that are recommended are about isolating ourselves. It's about taking me time. It's about the bubble bath. It's about go by yourself and sit on your porch and drink a cup of tea. It's very individualistic. And it's also unrealistic. And so what happens is that we get caught in this loop where we're being told self-care is the solution to all of your problems. And this is what self-care looks like. And then when we can't do it for all of these reasons, then we end up feeling guilt. We feel like failures. And that just ends up increasing our demoralization. And that's why I was so thrilled that the group of teachers I was working with wanted to take a deeper dive, because I wanted to get into why do we feel that, and where do these messages of self-care come from, and what other messages of self-care can we tap into that are going to actually empower us and make us feel good about what we can do.
Right. Yeah, and you actually, we've got an Integrating Montessori member here that has a comment. She says she's been a member of Integrating Montessori since its inception 6 months ago, and attending the meetings have been so useful to her, especially the self-care piece where it's not a one-size manual, like Andy says. And I speak to this on each and every member of the Integrating Montessori group, that this has changed our lives for the better. And she cannot begin to explain and express her gratitude to this group, which is so amazing. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for saying that. And I think Hitel, I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, awesome. What a great compliment.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hitel. That's it means a lot to me to know that this is actually helping all of you. Really
and one thing I wanted to say too about this particular topic is the list that you have is absolutely accurate. And I think I would add one more to it, which is sometimes it can actually be a disconnect button, mm-hmm. Where it's a way for you to escape from what actually is happening. And that again is fueling, increased demoralization. So it can be
right.
Button. Yeah, sometimes and that off button is when we need the on button to be on even more, just in a different way.
Yeah, we need the on button facing towards ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. It can become a way of dissociating, of just saying, okay, I'm just going to put my blinders on for 20 minutes right now. And I think it's really important to understand too that none of the things that people are putting out there as self-care and selling as self-care, they're not bad in and of themselves, right? They're not inherently bad. It's not a bad thing to sit down with a cup of wine when you need to. And it's not a bad thing to take a bubble bath. And it's not a bad thing to go and sit on your porch with a cup of tea. And it's certainly not a bad thing at all to dissociate if you're doing it with consciousness and awareness. When it becomes harmful to us is when it starts to be commodified and be sold as a one-size-fits-all and as the solution to our problems, when our problems are really so much more complex.
Mm-hmm. Right. Beautifully said.
So, again, because we wanted to kind of like tap into like, okay, so where did these ideas come from? We started to look at the history of self-care. And I'm going to try to be brief, and please tell me if I'm like, because I was a sociology student and I'm a big, huge geek about these things. So yeah, my main influences for looking at the history of self-care in Western philosophy were Michel Foucault, who is a French postmodern philosopher, and Audre Lorde, whose words on self-care are what actually first brought self-care back into public consciousness after many centuries of it being gone. So we went all the way back to ancient Greece, to Socrates. And Socrates was around from 440 BC to around 400 AD. And his main ideas were that self-knowledge and self-care are essential to moral development. Moral development cannot happen without self-knowledge and self-care. And self-knowledge and self-care, as far as he was concerned, were like inseparable. If you didn't have self-knowledge, you couldn't do self-care, and you couldn't do self-care if you don't have self-knowledge. So you can't do the one without the other. And he had a term for it, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm just going to leave it there, and people can look it up if they want to learn how to pronounce it. Hathal very kindly actually shared some links with me on how to pronounce it, and I forgot to look them up again before we started here, but they're out there. Anyway, this term translates directly as the care of the self, but it also means attending to the self, which gives it an entirely different connotation and really pulls together the self-knowledge and self-care piece, because attendance is different than caring. Attending to something has connotations of service, of paying attention, of being curious about, of engaging with something in a way that care doesn't. But care has the connotations of loving and nurturing that attending doesn't. So we have to look at it in context of those two meanings together as well. And self-care for Socrates was actually a really like full system of disciplines. So it included stuff like meditation and prayer and fasting and music and exercise, and of course, Socratic dialogue, right? And a Socratic dialogue is all about, here is a concept, now let's tear that concept apart until we find all of our biases and all of our judgments and everything we think we know about it. And let's question it all until we get to the little tiny nugget of truth that is inside that concept. And so they turned that on themselves. And that's the basis for the Socratic perception of self-care, right? Understand yourself, and then you can take care of yourself. Self-care for Socrates was also communal, because none of that can be done in isolation. So Socratic dialogue is not something you can do by yourself. Literally, like you literally need the other person there asking you questions, right? Prayer was done in groups. Exercise was done in groups, and music was done in groups. So it wasn't anything that isolated us, which is very different from those concepts that we were just talking about, right? The key for Socrates, though, was that self-care was a means to improving ourselves so that we could provide a better service, so that and he was actually talking to the ruling class when he said that it was about governance. So his view was that we have to examine ourselves and we have to care for every aspect of ourselves so that we can become better governors for our city-state. So for him, it was directly related to what today we would call equity or social justice, right? It was directly related to issues of policy and governance, which I find absolutely fascinating and so very deeply related to Montessori's ideas on the preparation of the teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all about social construction when it comes to that, you know, and you and I both have sociology backgrounds, so it's always really fascinating to talk about these particular concepts that are really at the beginning of a civilization manifesting in a new way.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. So that was Socrates, and Socrates was put to death for miseducating the youth, or so they said. And what happened is that then all the different groups that were emerging in that time, the Ropans and the Epicureans and the Cynics, they continued to kind of follow in his footsteps as far as self-care is concerned. But then this other group that was also founded by followers of Socrates, the Stoics, took an entirely different direction. And the Stoics were then very much the foundation for what then became the Christian ascetics in the early periods of Christianity. And they really laid the foundation for what we would see as notions of the self, of morality, and of virtue for the Middle Ages. So we're going from Socrates, who saw virtue as deep self-knowledge and self-care so that we could govern better. And now we're looking at the Stoics, whose ideas of virtue are very different. So they came around obviously after, and those are the dates, and their main ideas were self-denial and the doctrine of original sin. Now, their ideas of self-knowledge shifted. And their idea of virtue was, rather than a deep knowing of self in all aspects of self, it became about the elevation of reason. This is the Stoics, not the ascetics. So the Stoics became all about the elevation of reason and the suppression of emotion, and in particular, the passions. So fear and desire were to be suppressed. And so self-care became self-control. Instead of talking about the integration of the spirit, the body, the mind, and all of this, it became a separation of what you do and what you think and what you feel. And so the focus became on action rather than on intention or integrity. So it's a very big shift. And this is where, you know, when we talk about Stoicism now as being the ability to control your emotions when you're in really difficult situations, that's where these ideas come from, is from the early Stoics. So we're now talking about self-knowledge being more important than self-care, right? So we have to know ourselves so that we can know when we are responding emotionally, so that we can suppress those emotions, so that we can act in what they believed was a virtuous manner. Okay. So virtue is now about controlling our own behavior, more so than being about how we govern and about justice in governance. And discipline becomes more individualist and even more stringent than it was in Socrates' time. And self-denial becomes like the ultimate expression of virtue. So celibacy and those kinds of things start to emerge. So even the fasting becomes, you know, not just intermittent fasting, but denying oneself the pleasure of food constantly. So you can eat, but you can't eat anything that you are actually going to enjoy. So Stoicism continues to be influential even now, all of these centuries later. And during the end of the 4th century of the Common Era, so after the birth of Christ, is when we start to see really the emergence of the early church as a social power, right? Before that, the church did not have a lot of power. And this is when we start to see the church actually starting to gain more social capital, I guess is the word for it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the early Christians take on this Stoic definition of self-care, which is all about self-denial and austerity, and they infuse it with a sense of divinity. So it now becomes a holy thing to deny yourself pleasures. And the end goal for ascetics is obviously to get to heaven, right? So it's no longer about controlling our behavior, and it's no longer about better governance. It's about following the rules of the church so that we can attain a state of grace and enter into the kingdom of heaven when we die, which is an entirely different take on it, but we can see how it got there, right? Mm-hmm. So whereas the Stoics were talking about self-control for personal virtue, the ascetics are now talking about a complete renunciation of the power of self in service to the church and to God. Mm-hmm. So that's a really huge change from what Socrates was talking about. And another thing that the Stoics did was to, instead of having them be communal exercises, the ways in which people expressed their self-denial became public rituals. So there's a difference between a communal effort and a public ritual. Does that make sense?
Yeah. This is all fascinating.
Good.
I love that you're doing the history of self-care, because I think, as Montessorians, right, history and is the foundation of basically everything in our classroom. Mm-hmm. So it's really nice to have these concepts come back to, really their roots, so we can understand, really contemplate as we are deciding what we need to do for self-care, like where that journey really came from. So this is really fascinating.
Good. So I also see some of Dr. Montessori's ideas on the preparation of the teacher in the Stoics and the ascetics too, right? Because when she tells us that we have to control our reactions, right? It reflects what they're saying. And when she's telling us that we have to put on the vestments of humility, and when she's saying that we have to erase ourselves so that we don't impose ourselves on the children, it's a way of separating ourselves or of renouncing ourselves in service to the child. So I also, as I was doing this work, I also found it fascinating to see where she had her influences. So the ideas of the Stoics and the ascetics are pretty much what European society was built on. They were codified, and they became the moral and ethical guidelines for centuries. So they became really deeply entrenched in all of our interactions and in our values and in our belief systems. So the next period in history is Cartesian dualism and the Enlightenment and modernism. And here we're talking about a really broad period again. We're talking about from the 1600s to now. And I put it till now because there's a lot of confusion as to when modernism ends and what we're doing today. And because the beliefs and value systems developed during this time are really still very much influencing and impacting our lives today. The main concept here is the separation of mind and body, which comes out of Descartes' work, which led to a dualistic and mechanistic view of the universe. So the Enlightenment comes right after the scientific revolution, and it's also called the Renaissance and the Age of Reason. And there's a reason for that. So the scientific revolution is a quick recap for people who might not remember their, middle history there, is when Copernicus and Galileo and all of these other brilliant, fabulous minds came along and challenged the teachings of the church directly through mathematics and science, and they caused this return to the idea that maybe truth is not found through religion, maybe truth can be found through science and study and math and philosophy and logic. So in that respect, they were a return to the ancient Greek times, but in other respects, they were very, very different. So Descartes very famously said the line, "I think, therefore I am." And it is one of the most repeated lines, and it is one of the most misunderstood lines out there, right? What he was actually saying was, the only thing that I can verify objectively is that I exist. That's it. That's all it was meant to say. And yet it became this whole, thing about separation, right? It became about separating the mind and body. It became about separating the spiritual and the philosophical. And it led to a lot of compartmentalization. So if we start to look at the world as an objective and a subjective experience, we are effectively, very much like the Stoics, separating the two. So we're back to this idea of reason being much more important in the search for truth and meaning than spirit. So we're kind of like now in between Socrates and the Stoics, right? We're like, well, we want to go back to reason, but we're also going to keep them separate. And so this is the worldview that is referred to as Cartesian dualism. And it was the work of people like Newton really helped to push this forward, because they pushed the idea of the mechanistic universe, of the universe that could be understood by mathematical law. And so things like, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. Understanding the ways that physics works in the means of machinery. The growth of industrialism also helped to push this forward. So what happens is that we end up seeing reason as the only way to seek truth and virtue. And so self-knowledge becomes all about the cognitive, about the intellectual, about the mind. And so self-care all of a sudden has no value whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Because it is on the other side. It's on the side of the spiritual and the physical, which now seem to be much less important. Mind over matter. And so we end up with this highly individualistic, compartmentalized, and disconnected quest for knowledge. And that's where we are. We have this mechanistic view, which then is formalized in all of our behavioral codes and our ethical codes. It becomes the ideology on which the systems that we live today were created, right? It is the ideology that drove the Industrial Revolution. Mm-hmm. It also drove colonization and the exploitation of our planet, because we didn't understand the interrelationships. We were separating everything. And it also drove all of our social divisions. So it drove the compartmentalization of humans into nations, into ethnicities, into genders, into classes. So all of the divisions that we're struggling to reconcile today, those were created by this mode of thinking. The other thing that it brought us was the new ideal of productivity. All of a sudden, if there's no product, it doesn't matter. Whatever our efforts were, if there's no product at the end of it, our efforts were worthless. And so I think this is a time period that's really important to understand, because it brought us so much knowledge, and it brought us so far in terms of the ways that we understand the universe. And at the same time, many of the social issues and the physical issues that we're living with today are because of the mindset that emerged during those times as well.
That's so fascinating. And Tammy also mentioned that it's fascinating as well. She said she had no idea the connections of the historical path of self-care to our practices in Mission and Montessori, which is just, it's so interesting to make that connection, and especially now realizing where we're at. I mean, that what a concept, you know, to really challenge and think about where we're at.
Yeah, because where we're at didn't come out of nowhere.
Right.
You know?
That.
We're not Athena. We were not born fully grown, right? We came from somewhere. Our ideas all come from somewhere. Right. And so that actually brings us to after modernism. And I purposely called it that because postmodernism is a term that is used a lot and that nobody understands, and that is way too complicated to explain in the time that we have. So we'll just stick with after modernism. And that's roughly the time period between 1950s and today. And what emerges as the dominant values are kind of these two things that balance each other out. And that's the capitalism and the counterculture. And obviously capitalism holds a lot more power than counterculture, but they both emerged at the same time, and that's important to understand. The main concepts are also then at odds, because one is all about individualism and the other one is all about community. Mm-hmm. So in the late 1800s, I'm going back again. In the late 1800s, we see a shift in the understanding of science, and it happens through the work of Darwin, for one, and then the ways in which Darwin's work is validated by further studies in ecology, in genetics, and in biology. And at the same time, through the 1920s, we have all of these fascinating and fabulous theories coming out through astrology and theoretical mathematics and geology, and especially quantum physics, that all show that the mechanistic view of the universe doesn't actually hold up to scrutiny. We cannot view the universe as a machine, because it doesn't work that way. So there's this ideological shift that starts to take place again, and it pushes back against dualism, and it starts to look at things as systems, and it starts to look at chaos as a productive force. And so it starts to value the things that Cartesian dualism derides. And these kinds of huge ideological shifts take a lot of time, right? I mean, we saw how long each of the periods that I mentioned before was. And so this is where we are now, and this is where we find ourselves. We're caught in between this new ideas, these new understandings that we are complex systems, that our world is a complex system, that the universe is a complex system, and that they're all interrelated and they're all interdependent, and we cannot extricate them from one another. And we have all of these social systems and all of these values and moral and ethical codes that are still very much based in the idea of the mechanistic universe. And that's where we are today. We're in this kind of strange space where we know this is the way things are, but these are the systems we live with.
Mm-hmm. And what really spoke to me is the value of it, right? Like providing or offering or understanding what value comes out of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And you're so right. Like thinking about productivity, right? That's what our culture is based on. That's what global culture is right now. And if we don't produce something that is tangible, then it's not valuable.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's unfortunate, right? And of course, as Montessorians, we're like, the process is so important. Yes. Process. Right. Well, and so, I mean, interestingly enough, not only are we going against what we're countercultural, we're also this particular part needing to advocate for ourselves to be able to do self-care well, because it's not how our society views it.
Right. Yes. There is no tangible product that comes out of self-care.
Right.
It's in our way of being and it's in our relationships, but there's no tangible product that comes out of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So this is where we are. And 1950s are a fascinating time period because we're coming out of the trauma of the two world wars, right? So the entire world is in a state of trauma. Like, it's not just one or two countries. It's not just like one or two people. Like, it's the entire world is in a state of trauma. And the Western world settles into this new state of normal. And it's an unsteady feeling normal, but it's a new normal. And it's a new normal that is very much caught between the old and the new, because we're talking about the nuclear family, which is relatively new. We're talking about the suburbs, which are brand new. The rise of capitalism after industrial. So we're talking about post-industrial capitalism now. The growth of the middle class, the rise of the corporation, and most interestingly for me and for Montessorians, the emergence of the new stage of human life in adolescence. This is the first time that adolescence is really seen as its own stage of life. And all of these things shape what this new normal sees as virtue, because people are moving away from their religious views. Many people, obviously not all people. And so we're starting to figure out, where do we put our faith? And we're putting our faith in the suburbs and in corporations and in capitalism. And that shifts our values in a very different direction. And at the same time, no, hang on, before I get to the other side, before I get to the culture. So we have all of that going on, and we are implementing school in a different way too, right? So we have, school has already been industrialized, and all our subjects are compartmentalized. And what happens in this particular school structure is that it is so very much Stoic and Cartesian in the way that it's all about the intellect. And it's all about academics, and it's all about what we learn in our heads. And school does not value our spirit, and it does not value our bodies, and it does not value our movement, and it does not value our creativity. It's all about the intellect and reason, and about compartmentalizing all the subjects. So instead of seeing, those systems that we started talking about ecology and biology as systems that are related to all of the other systems, that you can't really separate biology and chemistry and physics, but we do separate them. And so we stop seeing the connections between them. And that's why we're caught in these kind of like strange places where we're like, we know there's more to this, but this is what we learned. So now we have this space where production, capitalism, and individualism are what are designed as success. This is now success replacing virtue as the goal of humanity. Socrates wanted us to be virtuous governors. The Stoics wanted us to be virtuous in our behavior. The ascetics wanted to be virtuous so that we could get into heaven. And the Enlightenment philosophers wanted us to seek truth and knowledge. And now we want material success. And that replaces virtue as the goal of human life. So, I mean, that impacts on our ideas of self-care, like so hugely, right? So self-knowledge doesn't really matter anymore. So we're not even just talking about self-care. We're also talking about self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is gone. We don't need it because we need to be successful over here. And we don't really start talking about self-care again until the 80s. So at the same time, and this is where I get really excited, in the 1950s, there also emerged this counterculture. And the counterculture movements were really very much about community and physicality and spirituality. And they found power in rejecting individualism and reason as the only goals in life. And they found power in rejecting productivity. And so, of course, I'm talking about the peace movement, but I'm also talking about the civil rights movement, and especially the anti-Vietnam War movements. Those were all predicated on the idea that, you know, we are together. We have to be together. We all were interrelated. And if we try to separate ourselves, bad things happen, right? So we're coming back to community and spirituality and back to the idea of justice and integration and a call to examine our belief systems. So these groups are bringing us right back to Socrates. And they're calling for governance based on virtue. So we have these two kind of balancing forces between capitalism and counterculture. And where Montessori fits in is very much on the counterculture side. So this is where we are. In the 1980s, Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, gives a series of lectures called The Hermeneutics of the Self. And in those lectures, he revives the idea of self-care. And so self-care becomes a really big topic in academic and philosophical circles. And it's not going to leak out because, you know, academics are like this and, you know, they're not going to talk to other people about it. But it starts to be a topic of conversation again. And he revised this idea that if we understand ourselves and take care of ourselves, and if we understand that our subjective informs the objective, then we can start to get back to the search for truth and meaning. And this is where postmodern philosophies and theories come from, and post-structuralist theories, which is that truth and meaning can only be found by the merging of the subjective and the objective. You have to have both together. And it's a complete rejection of the dualist emphasis on reason and objectivity. It's all about, what are my lenses? And how do I understand my lenses? And how do my lenses affect the ways in which I am seeing this world and in which I experience the world, and the ways in which the world experiences me? And then a couple of years later, Audre Lorde, who is a poet and an activist for many, many causes, starts to talk about, she's obviously part of the counterculture, and she starts to talk about self-care in a very different way. And what her activism was about was examining the various ways in which oppression functions based on all of our identities as a whole, as well as each of our individual identities. So she's talking about intersectionality years before Kimberly Crenshaw even comes up with the word. But she's looking at that and she's going, I am a Black woman, and I am a lesbian, and I am disabled, and I am the parent. And she's looking at all of these aspects of herself and she's saying, so where do I fit? And she's saying, and so how do my oppressions show up in different spaces? And so she's looking at identity as not being one thing, but she's looking at identity as being a whole series of things that we have to understand, and that when we examine them, we can actually start to fight oppression in a more effective way. So Lorde and Foucault, in their own ways, are both calling back to Socrates back to the concept of self-knowledge, back to the concept of being curious about ourselves and attending to ourselves. And then the other big piece that comes through in Audre Lorde's writing is self-care as self-preservation. And so in 1988, she had been fighting cancer. And she wrote these words. She says, "Overextending myself is not stretching myself. I had to accept how difficult it is to monitor the difference. Necessary for me as cutting down on sugar, crucial, physically, psychically. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." And these are the words that everybody knows now. And these are the words that reinvigorated the concept of self-care and brought it back to public awareness. And they're incredibly powerful words, because she is all of a sudden not only giving us permission to stop and take care of ourselves, but to make it a priority, because it is about our self-preservation. It is no longer an indulgence. And that's what she's saying here, right? It's not an indulgence. It's about survival. For her, it was literal survival, because she's talking about, living with cancer. For us, it's not necessarily literal survival, but it is still about self-preservation.
That's powerful.
Yeah. It's very powerful. So that brings us right back to where we started with Socrates, right? Was there anything you wanted to say before I move on to what Dr. Montessori says?
No, this is just really good reference to come back to, and a really good starting point to do some more research. Like, you've already intrigued me to go look into the history books again and kind of see my own check-in on all this.
Yeah.
No, but I'm curious to see what you've gathered for Dr. Montessori.
So Dr. Montessori wrote before the 1980s. So self-care wasn't even really a thing when she was writing, right? She was writing in that period where we weren't talking about self-care. So I was thrilled to find her words when she's talking about the self-preparation of the teacher in the Absorbent Mind. And it's the chapter called The Teacher's Preparation, chapter 27 of the Absorbent Mind. And she actually says, care of one's own person. I can't read that because it's behind my screen. Oh my goodness.
Do you want me to read it for you?
Yeah, can you read that?
Yep. So care of one's own person must form part of the environment in which the child lives. The teacher themselves is the most important, vital part of the child's world.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So even when the entire world was saying self-care doesn't exist, Dr. Montessori was saying the care of our person is super important, because we want to be our best self for the child. And that's the context of this. Right before that, she's talking about how we present ourselves of the children, that they know that they are in the company of the elect. And she's talking about how we study our own movements and perfect ourselves and present the very best of ourselves to the children. So she understood that in order to be our best self, we actually have to take care of ourselves. And one of my favorite things to talk about is the spiritual preparation of the teacher. And a huge aspect of that in Dr. Montessori's words is about that Socratic value of questioning, right? It's, where are my biases? Where are my assumptions about the children? Am I seeing this clearly? When we're doing observation, okay, the way most people do observation is not like this, but the way I was taught to do observation is very much about the melding of the objective and the subjective, so that it becomes a co-creative experience with the child. When we are thinking of ourselves as servants, when we are questioning our values, like all of these things, all of the unlearning that has to happen, it's all part of the spiritual preparation of the teacher. And it's very much influenced by each of those schools of thought that we looked at earlier.
Awesome. And then Andy, I just want to let you know, we probably have about 10 or so minutes before we've got to wrap up.
Okay, so let's keep moving. So what actually then is self-care? And how do we engage with it meaningfully? Well, self-care is purposeful work. So we have to get away again from the idea of productivity, and we have to look at it from a Montessori perspective, okay? Self-care is purposeful work. Its purpose is to protect our well-being. So the first thing we have to do is decide that our well-being is worth protecting.
That can be challenging for some people.
It can be very challenging.
I mean, I'm thinking from a parent perspective too, right? Like, not only is this challenging in your career, but you're in your professional life, but as a parent, we're getting the same kind of messages of
you have to be everything as a parent right now.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's so much pressure on parents. It's crazy. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is decide that we want to make it a practice. And Montessorians know all about practice, right? Practice is about repetition, and we know why repetition is important. It's also about discipline, and we're talking discipline here in the Montessori sense, right? We're talking about the discipline that emerges from within us when we normalize. And that's what the practice of self-care is about. It's about our well-being, which is adult normalization. It really helps to understand what your driving force is. So yes, the purpose is to protect our well-being. Why does your well-being matter to you? Socrates had a very clear driving force. It was governance. The Stoics had a clear driving force. It was virtue. The ascetics had a clear driving force. It was their faith. Audre Lorde's driving force was survival. So what is your driving force? If you can understand that, then it becomes easier to commit to the practice. Yeah. So it helps to think long-term and big picture in terms of what your overall goals are. And then it also really is absolutely essential to have small achievable goals. Because if we're aiming for our big picture and we make a plan based on our big picture, we're going to fail miserably, and then we're going to feel horrible, and we're never going to want to do it again. So choosing small achievable goals is really important. And that's what we worked through together at Integrating Montessori. My small achievable goal was to find a way to have some kind of joyful movement every day. So it's a small achievable goal. Now, once you have that, then you can get into the self-exploration around it. So again, you know what? This is really in a bad place. Okay, there we go. All right. So what nourishes you is a really big question that a lot of people don't even think about, right? Because we are so busy being productive that we don't think about self-nourishment as a product. So if we could think about self-nourishment as a product, what nourishes you? And then we can look at what our needs are. And when I'm talking about needs, I'm talking about, when we looked at an integrated Montessori, we looked at needs in terms of the fundamental human needs exercise. And we looked at it in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so it's really about assessing the ways in which your needs are being met and the ways in which your needs are not being met, and when they're being met consistently and when they're not being met consistently. And then it's about finding out how you can do it. And that's the next piece, right? What are the obstacles in your way to getting your needs met and to doing more of what nourishes you? And that can be a really tricky thing to see because we lie to ourselves a lot. Our most common obstacle is, I don't have time. And that's usually a cover for something deeper or a distraction. And really, if you can find someone to work with you through this of like, okay, what are the actual real obstacles? Then you can start to parse them, and get through that. And the most beautiful ways of getting past our obstacles are our community and our environment. So what are the ways in which our community can support us in getting over our obstacles, getting our needs met, and getting more nourishment? And what changes can we make in our environment that are going to help us get our needs met and nourish ourselves better? So a quick example, for me, my need was to move joyfully every day. And so one of the changes that I had already made to my environment is that I had already created a space for that. So there's a space already. I don't even have to think about where I'm going to go or what I'm going to do. The space is there. And community-wise, it was about talking to my son about my daily routines. So it can be really simple little things like that, right? We tend to think of these as overwhelming. So it's really important to like break it down, which we are so good at in Montessori, right? Think of this as preparing a lesson, like break it down into the tiniest little steps and see where the solutions are. And then create a specific plan. And the more specific, the better, because the more likely you are to do it. And the more likely you are to see where there are more obstacles that you had not identified. And talk to someone about it. Because when we talk to each other about it, we're far more likely to be accountable to ourselves. And we can call on the other person to help us be accountable, right? Like I can now tell my son, like, I didn't do it. And he can tell me, Mom, you forgot to do it, right? And then the most important thing is to reconnect with feelings of awe and gratitude. And I think that's probably self-explanatory as to why that is important to self-care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, we need more of that in our lives.
Yeah. And that can be really simple things. I post a good thing on Facebook every day, and that just helps me remember, even when I'm having the worst day, there was one little good thing, right? Most people don't want to be that public about it. So write it down or keep a gratitude journal or take a second and just look around and find something to be grateful for. Like it doesn't have to be a big thing. Mm-hmm. It's just a moment. Just a moment. So you also asked me to think about how school owners and administrators can support their teachers in this work, right? Mm-hmm. So as with all Montessori things, we have to prepare the environment for it, right? We have to decide this is important to us, and then we prepare the environment for it. So again, administrators have to recognize that self-care is purposeful work. And then we have to make space for it. And these are some ways that it could look for it, right? If you value it, you have to make it a priority. And the first thing you have to do always is prioritize adult relationships. And I'm sure this is something you tell your clients often. Mm-hmm.
Parent to family relationships all the time.
Absolutely. And within the school environment, if the administrators and the teachers don't have a great relationship, that trickles down into the classroom environments. And it is also reflected in the environment, in the relationships with the parents too. So the tone that is set by the relationship between administrators and teachers, it sets the tone for the entire school, really. So we have to prioritize those adult relationships, and a really important way of doing that is to build trust. And that means you have to be consistent, you have to show your competence, you have to be honest, like just build trust and be available and make that explicit and implicit. So, tell your teachers that you were available and also be there when they need you, right? You have to do both. You have to walk it and you have to talk it. And the same with being approachable. You can't support somebody else's self-care if they don't trust you and if they cannot approach you. So be approachable. And part of that is your own self-care and self-knowledge, and like check your body language and check your tone of voice, right? Make sure that you are being approachable. Valuing staff time and capacity. This is one of the biggest complaints I hear from teachers. Like, they expect so much from me, I can't do one more thing. If you really want your staff to be at their best and you want them taking care of themselves, you have to value their time and their capacity. And that means, like, no, you don't ask your staff to send an email on the first day of school to every family with details about what every child did, because the teachers are exhausted. You know, and it also means thinking about when you schedule your meetings and how often you schedule your meetings.
I would also say how prepared your meetings are too.
Agenda. Do you really need that meeting? Does that have to be a meeting, or could it be an email?
Right. Yeah.
It's, you know, how much do you value their time and their capacity? Cultural responsiveness is huge, right? If you want your staff to be able to come to you, and if you, you know, a huge part of self-care is spirituality. So I'll take a religious example here, right? If you have a staff member who is Muslim and working during Ramadan, are you going to find ways to support them while they're not eating during daylight hours? If you have a staff member who is Jewish, are you going to plan school events on Friday nights? So it's these kinds of things that can make a really big difference in helping a person feel valued and welcome and cared for. And when we feel cared for, we value our own self-care all the more. Creating a culture of mutual support is really important, right? And that you have to lead by example. You offer your support and you actually follow through with it. Again, gratitude, but also acknowledgement, right? That can be built right into every single meeting and every single email that you send out and every single conversation that you have with your staff. Make sure they know they are valued. You can also create policies that empower staff, right? You can make a policy that says, if you need a self-care day, you take it, right? Do you have policies that encourage self-care? Do you have sick day policies and mental health day policies and family grievance policies? And, you know, do you have leave for when somebody's family is really sick or when a family member dies? What are the policies that you have that empower your staff to deal with the issues in their lives? Talking about self-care openly can create a lot of room for it too. So that's important. And then finally, consider having wellness plans as part of your documents that you use on a regular basis. And here are just two examples of those. But really the big question always is, what would we do for our students? And then are we doing that for ourselves and for our staff?
Mm-hmm.
So just a couple of examples of wellness plans, which are tools for self-care and community care. You could have a sheet of paper like this somewhere in the school where people can fill this out when they're going into a major event or they're going to go into a very difficult conversation. Imagine the power of being able to say to your boss, like, this is going to be a really tricky conversation and I need your support in this way. And that's just another example, same thing, but different format, because different people think different ways. And that's it.
Would you, Andy, be able to provide those resources? I imagine our members would love to have them, because we actually just talked about creating plans for parents and their goals for their children and their families in relation to Montessori. And I feel like this could be really helpful in tandem with Tammy and Simi's presentation a couple weeks ago about professional development. Like, we're really looking at all the adults in our community to make sure that they feel valued, understood, heard, so they can do the best that they can do in the role that they're playing, whether it's parent, teacher, staff.
Yeah.
So really helpful.
You know, I think this is having Just one of these questionnaires as part of your professional development planning or feedback forms would be amazing, right?
Right. And
Yeah.
Tammy says, thank you. This was fascinating and helpful in both my own attendance to my self-care and in cultivating this in Montessori communities. So thank you for addressing cultural responsiveness as well. And she loves the idea of a wellness plan.
Of course she does.
Yes, indeed. And do you, so with these wellness plans, do you see this being a document that guides and staff go to regularly and use, or does the administration hold on to it, or how do you see this playing out inside of a community?
You know, I think it really depends on that community. I don't think there's one way that would work better than another. I think it really depends on how that community functions and what is the standard for them. I think teachers should ideally have easy access to these papers so that they can fill them out whenever. I think there should be an option to make them anonymous if need be, because nobody owes anybody their diagnosis, right? So if somebody is, you know, neurodivergent and doesn't want to be open about it, they could fill this out and say, this is what I need for this conversation, or this event will be difficult for me because of the lighting. You know, right. What can we do?
Yeah. Yeah, and it really gives you a way to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, which is what we want, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, Andy, thank you. This was so rich and full of information and so many resources available, and just a really, really good topic all around to talk about and continue revisiting. As you said earlier, you know, this is always a good topic to, no matter the time of year, to talk about. So I appreciate your preparation for this.
My absolute pleasure. Yeah. And again, you know, if people want to continue the conversation, this is where they can find me.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you again, Andy, and thank you to our live attendees.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everybody for being here.
All righty. Sounds good. You enjoy the rest of your week.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.